this is a generosity challenge. And what we're doing, and the cool thing was they didn't have to come up with it. It was actually our money. But it was,
Okay.
So what we said was, everybody gets $50. Everybody's got the same $50. What we'd like you to do is really pray about what God would have you to do with it, and then find something to do and give it. And then at Christmas, we'll share the stories.
Yeah.
All right, we are all red.
We're red.
Red means go.
Red means
In
we're
this
recording,
tech
right?
weird world.
We're good?
Yes, we are good.
All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are listening, whatever time you're listening, we're so glad you've decided to give us your precious and valuable time to join us on another episode of our On Purpose Parent podcast.
Hey.
What's going on? What's going on?
Hey.
What?
Look who's back.
Yeah!
We got Chris Goulart back. Oh my goodness.
Chris Goulart for the
We love Chris
final
so much.
closeout. Oh my goodness. I mean, this series, parents, if you are just joining us for the first time, we are in our third week of a 3-episode series on coaching our kids to be good stewards of money, of the resources God has given us, of their time, their talents. Because one of the things we've talked about is really if we teach our kids about money in the right way from the foundational principles, we're actually teaching them life skills, the ways to live in a way that is intentional, that is fulfilling, and that helps them achieve their goals. I mean, just in these past 2 episodes, I have learned so much from our wonderful guest, and super excited to close out this series we're taking a little bit of a shift here, talking about generosity and giving. And so in our first episode, if you haven't listened, we talked about real core principles that are important to start off with before any conversations on money happens. And then second episode, we talked about real practical, tangible tips and tactics. And, you know, Chris mentioned this. We only just scratched the surface on that. We talked a little bit about allowance and budgeting and how those interactions with our kids can really lead to just wonderful life outcomes and skills. And you're seeing that with your own son as well now that he's like 23. But now we're saying, okay, so we know who we are, what our identity is, and that we're stewards of God's money. We maybe have some tips that we can teach our kids on how we can help them manage money and handle money and not be overwhelmed by it and learn these skills. But what does giving have to do with this, right? Because now we're like saying, now that you've earned the money, managed the money, you know how to think about money. And this does actually tie very well to episode 1, but now we're talking about generosity and giving. And that can be, you know, a sensitive subject because sometimes it's you give because you might feel guilty, like this is something I have to do. But back in the back of your mind, you might be like, oh, can I really do this? Can I not? And so we're just really excited to get into this topic.
And a reminder for our listeners, if you've been listening to us for a while, or if I think we're like at 35,000 now subscribers, which is fantastic.
Oh, wow.
Which, by the way, if you enjoy our podcast, please subscribe to it if you haven't yet, and share it with some friends that you think it might be helpful. But the idea of our On Purpose Parents podcast is we come from a theological worldview. So the idea that Grace, let me see your glasses. Can I?
Yeah.
Oh, she's handing me the glasses if you're watching this, and I hope I don't stretch them. Oh my gosh!
Wait, is it strong or not
That is
strong?
super clear.
Oh yeah.
I need these glasses.
Do
Can I
you
keep
need
the
it?
glasses?
Yes. Do you need it to look at something? What do you need them for?
No, just the idea of what a worldview is. It's how you view the world. So when I'm looking through these pair of glasses, it was
so illustration.
Clear.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
that was great.
But it's how you view the world. That's exactly what it is. And the way we view the world, we come from the foundation that there is a God, and that He created everything. He owns everything. And that He never creates without a plan or a purpose. So He has a purpose and plan for all of us. And the idea of talking about money, this is where we're coming from. When we're talking about God's ownership and stewardship of things, how we should manage things, including our children, but also money, and how do we teach our kids to do that, it all comes from Scripture. And that's what each one of our episodes is about. It's what our entire On Purpose Parent strategy is about, because there's like a bazillion parenting strategies out there. Right. So what makes ours unique and different? Well, we're biblical, one thing. And then our desire is that we want to raise kids who are interdependent, lifelong followers of Jesus who desire to make a kingdom contribution. So everything we have points toward that. And we've got Chris here who's written Teaching Your Kids About Money workshop, which is a fantastic workshop. And he says, hey, I want to give this away free to all the parents. So we've uploaded that in a PDF. Go to onpurposeparents.com/resources, and you can find it there, download it, and look through it. A wealth of information.
And it's not just words. I mean, there's pictures and graphics for those that like the visuals like me, just not have it feel so dense in content.
Yeah.
This is really wonderful.
Yeah.
I love it. All right.
But we have him back again.
Yay! And we need to have him
gosh.
back in the future as well.
Definitely.
That'll be a mission of mine.
Will you come back in the future?
I would love to.
Like as many times as we want?
I'd be honored. Yes.
Got it on the record.
Nice. So let's dive into it. You talked a lot last episode about how you trained and supported and coached your kids in like saving and making wise decisions and being able to have a goal. Like, I want to buy the skateboard, and how long would it take for me to buy the skateboard, and really think through that. But where does and maybe you could talk about your own experience raising your kids. Where did giving fall into that? Other than maybe putting it into like one of the buckets that you mentioned when you get allowance, you talked about 3 different jars: the giving, the saving, the spending. Is that the extent of it, or where does giving fit into like what we can do as parents to encourage a spirit of generosity and giving with our children?
Well, first of all, let's start with that example you gave, because I think that's important to start at a very young age to help kids understand that giving is just something that we do as Christians. It's not optional. You know, we know the subject of the Bible is Jesus, right? But the verb of the Bible actually is give. God so loved the world that he gave. So
that's good.
You know, I think you can give without loving, but you can't love without giving. And so giving is just part of the Christian walk in general. We have to incorporate that into who we are. The gift of giving or generosity is one of the spiritual gifts that's referred to. And not everybody has that gift, but that doesn't mean we're not supposed to be generous, right? So being generous, generosity is something that God wants for us and wants in us. And so that hopefully becomes part of our identity. And the more we can sort of shape that and bake that into our kids' identity from the beginning is really important. And that we're not, you know, God didn't put us on earth just to be selfish, right? Not just to take care of ourselves, but actually to help others, to pour into others, to benefit others, and to grow his kingdom. So when we start to realize that, and as they grow up with that mindset, that's going to dramatically shift that worldview that Chris was talking about, right? It's a different set of glasses for them. So one of the ways to do that, you talked about the 3 jars that we talked about in the last episode, the idea of right from the very beginning, as kids get allowance or earn money, whatever, that some of that is going into their giving jar. And the fun part about that giving jar, to me, like, and I talked about that, about how we always had the kids put 20% into their giving jar. And 10% was the tithe. That goes to the local church, which I believe is what we should be doing anyway, right? So 10% goes to the local church. But the other 10%, the Bible talks about tithes and offerings. And people have different views on the tithe, but I think the Bible's very clear that we should be doing it. 10% is 10% of the gross goes to your local church. That's a tithe. But beyond that, the Bible talks about offerings, or any kind of gifts we give above and beyond the tithe. And I wanted to teach my kids about that as well from a young age. So the idea that they were tithing and they were taught to do that, but then experiencing the joy of giving beyond that. And I remember one year when one of my boys, their school teacher, I forget what grade they were in. Honestly, I don't remember. I want to say 3rd grade, 4th grade, something like that. Their teacher was going on a mission trip and had said to the kids, like, hey, here's what I'm going to be doing and all that kind of stuff. And there were probably rules around fundraising and stuff like that. But my son, they knew that he was raising money for it. And my son said, hey, Dad, can I use my giving money to give it to, the teacher for his trip? Oh. And I was like, absolutely.
Yeah.
And what was interesting is what came out of that, because I think there's so many, these principles all sort of tie together in some ways. I remember when the teacher came back, and I remember my son being so excited to hear the stories of the trip. Oh. Because what's interesting? Matthew 6:21 says, where your treasure is, your heart will be.
Right.
And that's Jesus talking. He says, and it's not the heart that comes first. It's interesting. The treasure comes first in that verse. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's Matthew 6:21. So I watched my son, who took some of, his money, if you will, and gave it to the teacher for a trip. And when the teacher came back, he was so excited to hear about what was the impact, what did you do?
Wow.
Because he, as a little guy, had invested in this trip.
Wow, yeah.
So he had skin in the game for this trip and the cool thing was, and the teacher was able to affirm him, like, hey, because you helped me do this, you got to help some families over in this country, and you got to do, you see what I'm saying? So my son all of a sudden felt like he got to participate in this person's trip,
That's
like this
really
mission
cool.
trip. As a little guy, by investing in it. And I thought, wow, like I didn't even expect, I wasn't really thinking through that when it happened. It just sort of did. And I watched it unfold. And I thought, wow, that is amazing to see how, like, seeing him and actually then experience the joy of giving too. Because I think a lot of times people view, like, when I wasn't really taught much about giving growing up. Okay, so this is part of my journey, which is why it's so personal to me and why giving and generosity is one of my favorite things to talk about. Because it's part of my own life journey and it's a struggle that I've had. When I was first taught about tithing, I didn't want to do it because I felt like, man, I'm out there making all this money and I'm doing, like, why would I turn around and give it away? Like, that doesn't make sense, right? And I learned that, the idea of tithing, I mean, the Bible says in Deuteronomy 14:23, it says the purpose of tithing is to teach us to revere the Lord your God always. And so it's about
the heart.
Yeah, the tithe isn't about a legalistic thing. It's really about learning to give to God. And in Hebrews, there's a whole description of Melchizedek and the idea of Jesus came in the order of Melchizedek, but the idea of that the first tithe actually in the Bible was Abraham. It was way before the law. Because sometimes people go, isn't that kind of Old Testament stuff, the tithe? Like it's way before the law. Abraham gave 10% to Melchizedek. Jesus came in the order of Melchizedek. There's a very strong connection back to Jesus. And what you see there is that Abraham, why did he tithe to Melchizedek? Because he was under the spiritual authority of Melchizedek. And he's kind of this interesting... I don't want to get too deep into the theology of it, but there's some people believe that was an archetype of Christ and stuff like that. But when you look at, wait a minute, I'm under the authority of Christ, and that's part of my learning experience, part of my spiritual growth, that because I am under his authority, because God gives me 100% of what I have coming in, and he's just asking me to return 10% back to him, and I get to manage the other 90%. See, when I first started tithing, it felt like, wait, I give this much to the federal government, I give this much to this. It's like a tax, and now I got to give 10% back to Jesus, like a tax. And a friend of mine said, no, you're looking at it all wrong. He gave you 100%. He's just asking you to reserve 10% and return it to him. You get to manage the 90, and it's like, wait, the math is the same, but like very different mindset.
Yes,
you know what I mean? And so for me, that was kind of part of the learning experience. And I wanted that for my kids because I didn't grow up learning how to tithe as a kid. So I had to learn how to do that when I was like 29, I think I was.
Gotcha.
And I fought it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't because I couldn't afford to tithe, because it was a heart issue, right?
Right.
And so I wanted my kids just to grow up and learn the obedience of giving. But beyond that, then to go into the joy of giving. Because I think generosity starts after the tithe. The tithe is obedience. Generosity comes out of what you're giving out of the 90%. And so I wanted my kids to experience that. And what I've seen in my kids, and I don't want to speak out of school because I wouldn't want to share too much about their giving right now, whatever, but I'll just say this. I've been very proud of both of my boys, not just because they tithe, they do that, but I've watched them as young men give above and beyond their tithe without me prompting it or saying anything about it, just because they're talking to God and they feel like they want to and God wants them to, and they just do it.
Wow.
And, as they're young men, they're saving for a home, or they're that kind of stuff. They're doing all that like anybody their age would be or should be.
Right.
But they also want to give, and that's a value that it was affirming to me as dad. Like when I saw my son, both of my boys doing stuff like that, I was like, wow, I must have done something right along there.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
there's this sort
that's
of,
so rewarding. Yeah.
and it's like just for them to live. And I thought, man, like as adults, like we don't get, because we get worried and all that kind of stuff. And they're young, but they've learned these lessons at a young age. So like, how do we build that into our kids? And I think sometimes it's the tools we have, whether that's the bank or whatever, that we can start to build into them to help them learn those experiences and actually do things together as a family sometimes. I've seen families that go, hey, we're going to go serve at the food pantry together, or you can give your time and you can do things like that and serve together. I think those are very important life experiences. And time is really important, but giving money is different than giving time. And Jesus talked about giving money in a very specific way. You can't just substitute them.
So
interesting.
Why do we want our kids to be givers? Why do we want them to give? And one of the things you had said was, I'm thinking that parents might be thinking, I don't want someone to take advantage of my kids. And it kind of makes me think of a dad fail when Macy Joy, my youngest, was little. So she's in, I don't know, it was like first, second grade, it was early elementary. And the teacher came and said, I just wanted you to know Macy Joy had a $20 bill that she gave to this little boy.
Okay.
And I was like, what? And she goes, well, don't worry, here, I'm giving it back to you. And I was like, oh, thanks. And take it home. And I'm like, Macy, this was some of the money she had saved. I'm like, what? Why would you just give that to him? Well, he was hungry and he didn't have any money. So I just told him I'd give him money. So the next day I went, I got money and I took it and I gave it to him. I'm like, what are you thinking? Why did you? And then later I was like, I am such a jerk. That is such a great thing to do. And I just squashed that. And what a dad fail with that. Yeah.
It's such a good question, though, because Sam and I have had a similar struggle. Not so much like, what are you doing? But there is, and this is a question I would love to hear from Chris, is when they're younger, I find, at least in my experience, I have a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old. But when they were younger and we bring them to those experiences and the joy of giving, and make it human, and there's a story, they are so responsive to it. So it's like a prime age to teach them that. I think that is a really great point. But one of the things Sam and I have wrestled with is okay, so giving is good. Let's say they've reacted really well to the experience of giving and the joy that comes from giving. But then they are actually so generous. They're like, well, can we just buy them a new bike? Or can we, we were giving sandwiches to homeless in the area, and one of the guys got their bike stolen, and we all felt so terrible. Yeah. And our daughters were like, let's just go buy a new bike. And we're like, do we? Do we not? And then sometimes in their jar save, their save jars, it's like, well, what if I want to give them everything. I want everything that I have in this jar. I want to give it to them, right? So, there's both spectrums, right? You have kids that might be super generous beyond what we think is what we would have reacted to be.
Yeah.
And what does that mean about us? Or sometimes the next question I'll ask is, what if they say, no, I don't want to give at all? In this spectrum. But let's first start with what you were saying, Chris, is when they're over, when we think they're maybe super
that they're
generous.
Doing too much. But one of the things that I wanted to say is I've been to total privilege of being able to hear you speak at a number of different workshops. Tina and I both went, and we've sat under your teaching in that and learned from you so much over the years. One of the things that you would say is, think about who the happiest people are in life right now. It's people who are givers. And I heard you say that word joy of giving with that. But it's people who are givers. And the people who are miserable, that root word of miserable is miser. And a miser's a hoarder. So it's the people who hoard and take and don't give are miserable. I was like, wow, that is so good. I want my...
Yeah.
But then I also love what you said about Jesus gave. And you can't love without giving.
Right.
Right. That's a key.
Well, I think
so
so. If we're look, as a Christ follower, if I want to become more like him, we just have to realize, he gave it all. Look, we can't match that, and he doesn't expect us to. But there's certainly as a role model, right? There's certainly something he laid out that we have to learn. If we want to be more like Christ, we have to learn how to give and be generous,
Yes.
right? And again, we're never going to match him in anything, and that's okay. But it's an important character trait that I think we want to build in our kids and live out ourselves, right? Because you kind of asked earlier, like why to give and all that kind of stuff, like because life isn't about me in the beginning. Like it's really like Christ didn't, like he said, I came not to be served, even though he deserved to be served as God, and he came to serve. So how can we learn to live our lives in a servant role to be like more like Jesus and give to others? And that doesn't mean you can't have fun. It doesn't mean you can't have nice things even or anything like that. But we want to do it in the context of like, what is God calling us to do for his kingdom and for his church and for his world, and to reach people for Christ. And so when we sort of view those as things that are aspirational for us, we have to learn to grow in that giving. And for kids to learn that in the beginning, and I want to come back to you guys each had a story about kind of over giving, which is interesting.
Hey,
because
take it easy. Don't get it. Don't
you don't
get out
see
of
that in
control.
adults a lot.
Yeah.
Right, you don't.
You
yeah.
really don't. And I think it's a fascinating thing to think about that you both of you have kids that you saw that, and I saw that in my kids too. And yet as parents, we kind of go, because there's this balance of like, wait a minute, that's not good stewardship, right? And it reminds me of a Bible story that when a few days before Jesus was crucified, he was in a house, and Mary was there with some of the disciples, and she breaks this jar of perfume and pours it on Jesus. And in the story, if you kind of go look at that, the disciples grumble and they say, "Why are you, Mary? What are you doing? That could have been all that money could have been sold, and that money could have been used to help the poor."
Yeah.
And what's interesting to me is what is Jesus' response? He goes, "Wait, you guys don't get it. Like, she's doing something more important, and in the future, that story will be told forever, and it's in Scripture now, right?" And I look at that story, and I'm kind of like, man, if I were in the room, I'd be like the disciples. I'd be going, "What are you thinking, Mary?
Yeah.
Like that, what a waste," right? And yet it's one of the greatest acts of worship that we see for Jesus in the entire New Testament. And when our kids are doing something like that, I guess the question I would ask now, and I don't know how well I did with this when my kids were little, to be honest. I mean, it's hard to remember exactly all that. But as I look at it now, like, I don't want to get to heaven one day and God go, "Man, I was trying to teach your kids a lesson and you screwed it up." You know what I mean? Like your kids were growing in generosity and you taught them the opposite.
Kiboshed it, yeah.
Yeah. Like to me, that's sort of like a heavy thing. Like I don't want to have God ever do that with me. I don't know that I can really point to any stories of somebody going, "Man, I gave a bunch of money away and I really regret it." Like I don't hear those stories.
Yeah.
That's the adage of somebody when they get to their deathbed, you never hear them say, "Oh, I wish I worked harder," or that kind of stuff. It's more like, "I wish I had more time with my family. And when Acts 20:35 says it's more blessed to give than to receive, right? And Paul's quoting Jesus when he says that. I want my kids to experience that joy.
Yeah.
Like, so we want that for them. And at some point there's going to be this place of like, wait a minute, if you want to do something to help the poor, what's the best way to do that? And when they're older, I think you can uncover some of those things. Because I do think there are things that sometimes we can do things for the poor that actually are harmful and not helpful. And that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah.
There's some great even books written about that. But what I care about in the short run really is more, how do I develop this heart of generosity in my kids, and how do I foster that? Because I just think that's so cool. And Chris, as you said, like that, if you say, "Hey, do you want to hang around a bunch of stingy people or hang around a bunch of generous people?" Like everybody knows the answer to that question.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's kind of a lay down because you want and don't you want to be generous, and like that's a winsome quality, and you want to raise your kids with that quality. But part of it is I think we got to model it, and I'm married to a woman who is just amazing, and she's so generous, and she just lives it. And so I think partly my kids got a lot more from Jen than they did from me, because I think I'm more the financial planner. I tend to be more like, careful and stuff like that.
Right.
And so generosity is, as I said, is hard for me, which as I think why God has me teaching on it so much, because I think I need to hear it as much as anybody.
Yeah.
But
I think you owe me about 5 lunches. When I look over the years, I get like, I'm always on buying.
Yeah.
I'm just allowing you to express generosity.
Yeah. He's gifting you.
But so you think about like, what are those? So but I think you guys each raised great examples of like, how could we do that with the kids and say, as a family, to say, hey, if you want to do something, like if you're willing to empty your jar, if you're willing to empty your jar, Dad and I are willing to kick in. Let's do something as a family. What would be the best thing to do?
Yeah.
And maybe in the moment you go, I don't know if this is really the best use of our funds, but maybe it's a lesson the kids will never forget, right?
Right.
And so there's things like that. I'll just give you one of the other things that we did with our kids when they were young, which I thought was super fun. We would, on Thanksgiving, and we did this for the first year we did it was kind of fun because the kids weren't expecting it at all. We had a little envelope at Thanksgiving, and everybody at the table, my mom was there, I remember. I can't remember who else was there at Thanksgiving, but my kids, obviously. And everybody at the table had a little white envelope. And we said, don't open that. We're going to open that later. And people were like, okay. And it was kind of this whatever. And then later in dinner, people kind of forgot about it. Probably gravy spilled on them or whatever. But before we got to dessert, it was like, okay, everybody open your envelope.
Okay.
And everybody had a nice, crisp $50 bill that we had gotten from the bank in the envelope.
Okay.
And the idea was, this is a generosity challenge. And what we're doing, and the cool thing was they didn't have to come up with it. It was actually our money. But it was, so what we said was, everybody gets $50. Everybody got the same $50. What we'd like you to do is really pray about what God would have you to do with it, and then find something to do and give it. And then at Christmas, we'll share the stories.
What? That's idea. Amazing.
And so,
that's awesome.
like, in your case, like for Macy Joy, like what would, like, if for $20 it's like, hey, I just wanted to bless this kid who didn't have enough lunch money. Like, that's a cool story, right?
Yeah.
And in a way, you're kind of making it safe to say, look, here's $50. I'm actually expecting you to give it. Mm-hmm. So there's not like, oh, am I doing the right thing? It's more like, it's almost like if I don't give it by Christmas, I don't have a story. Like I need to do something like in the next month, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of an interesting thing. And as adults, I think sometimes we go, okay, I'm tithing. And a lot of people, unfortunately, don't even get that lesson, which is really sad because I think that's a huge sort of spiritual growth step for people.
Discipline,
Yeah, and I think people come to a new spiritual place when they begin to do that. But then beyond that, it's like, wait a minute, how can I really grow in generosity and stretch myself? And learning how to do that. And I think like it's like anything else. As a kid, if you play sports, like as an adult, like exercise is sort of like a more natural thing. If you've never exercised in your whole life and all of a sudden you go, I want to get into shape, it's kind of like, wow, that's really hard, right? Yeah. So how do we build some of that discipline and just the mindset of generosity into the kids? And I just think that's, it's not like there's always a right and wrong answer, but it's like, are we thinking through that and are we modeling that as adults and are we living that way?
Yeah. You've brought up family a number of times, that you model this with family, bring the kids along and do it. And I've seen this practiced with Grace and with Sam and their kids. And in just such an incredible way. We're talking finances and money a lot, but also our most valuable thing is our time, right? Our time is our life. So when we give our time away to people, that is so important, giving that way. And there was just this past Christmas. Gosh, I'm gonna cry a little bit, I think. Okay. So let me try not to. So this past Christmas, Tina, my bride, was kind of dealing a lot with cancer and going through chemo. Lost all her hair, feeling sick and in pain and all this. So there's a knock at the door. And then we hear Christmas carols being sung. And I look out and I see it's Grace and her family. And I call Tina up and Tina comes and she opens up the door and they're singing Christmas carols. And they brought gifts for her. Wow. And they took time to draw some cool little things. And they gave her hugs and the words of encouragement of we love you and those types of things. So they not only spent their money on this stuff, but they gave their time, and this beautiful family showed up and blessed my bride. And it's something I'll love you guys forever for that.
We love you too.
And be indebted to you forever for that.
That's
but
awesome.
It's just, but it's doing that kind of thing with your kids that, hey, if someone's hurting or in pain, how can we help them out?
Yeah.
Is it a financial component? Is it our time? What does that look like? And being giving like that is so important. So when we have kids that give like that, or
I'm getting teared up just hearing your story. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
I sometimes I think, coming out of the financial world and particularly like me, I think sometimes charity to me is like the things you get a tax deduction for.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And that's not biblical giving.
Yeah.
That might be what the IRS thinks of as far as charitable giving, but that's not biblical giving. Can be time. It can be anything else. And the truth is we should do both. And what I saw in that example is both combined. It was time and resources that were given together. And sometimes it goes that way.
Yeah.
I find sometimes when people have a lot of money, they find it easier to give money. Sometimes people have more time, find it easier to give time. But the truth is, I think we all have to give both. And that's the stretching thing sometimes. But I love, how sometimes they can come together and just really just express love to somebody like that. I think that's a wonderful example. And it's interesting for you to talk about that being on the receiving end too, because I think for a lot of us, it's actually, I'll speak for myself. It's hard to receive sometimes, and it's hard to be in that place of because I like to give,
yes.
But it sort of sometimes feels awkward to receive from somebody else,
Right.
and yet we're in a place like that where you can. It's just such a huge blessing to be able to receive from that. And I think what a great lesson for your kids to be able to do that.
Yes.
And really, it was. I mean, what you're pointing out, it's a beautiful cycle, like giving and receiving, because us giving at that Christmas time, really, we were majority on the receiving end of Chris and his beautiful bride, as he said, Tina, and they've treated us out to meals when we were sick. They'd what is it? Those Amazon
gift cards or something?
No. The
Gift
place where you
basket.
actually drop off groceries at your house. Someone drops off the groceries.
Yeah, DoorDash.
DoorDash, or with box of tissues and cough drops. So my kids have seen, and each time they do that, I try to show them, this came from this person, this person. So they were on the receiving end of so many things from the Reeds that it was a cycle. Us giving back was part of that kind of give, receive, beautiful economy. And even when we went to do the Christmas carols, Tina was like, hold on. And she went back and she had gifts for the kids because she had made little socks and cards and notes to give to the nurses that were helping her with her chemo treatment. So it was even then it was a lesson for our kids on generosity, receiving generosity. They walked away with presents, So I just think it goes back to what you were saying at the very beginning is, sometimes we're like, how do we teach our kids generosity? How do we beat this into them? How do we, make them put the right amount into the right safe, the give jar? But you talked about the story with your son and how he got invested with being able to donate to his teacher. It's about relationships.
Yeah.
It's about the beauty of community. And when you get a taste of that and help your kids get a taste of that by living it out together, what you said, such a wonderful reminder. That's what can, generate that desire, and it's not forced on them.
Well, giving is something that we do, but generosity is an attitude of the heart. And I think sometimes that we get confused of those two different words because they actually mean they're connected, but they mean two different things.
Yeah.
You could again, I can give to you something without being generous. But I can't be generous without giving, right?
Yeah.
So generosity is sort of a bigger
That's really
thing.
good.
And I think that's what God wants for us. The idea of He wants us to just live generously. And that can come out in very small things. It can look different. You don't have to be wealthy to be generous. You can do acts of kindness and those can be generous.
Yeah.
And I think, God wants us to be generous with our finances for sure. But it's not as simple as that, right?
Right.
Sometimes we kind of want to put it in a box, it's
Right.
like this formula. If we do this, then we're okay. And it's not that. It's really about a heart issue. Because when Jesus is in front of the temple and you see all the wealthy people throwing in their offerings, and Jesus kind of calls the disciples together and says, "Hey, watch this." And the widow comes up and puts in her 2 little copper coins, right?
Yeah.
The story of the widow's mite. And he says, "I tell you the truth, she gave more than all the others." And I think in that moment, Jesus because first of all, he's saying something that doesn't make sense, because literally the beginning part of that passage talks, and it's not a parable, it's literally a story. He's in front of the temple, and the story says that they're sharing, they're giving large amounts, and she gives a little tiny. So then Jesus says she gave more than all the others, which we know mathematically is false.
The math is wrong.
The math does not, saying, wait a minute, no, Jesus is good at math, so what's going on here? Yeah. And I think what he's doing is kind of redefining generosity for us, because she gave out of her poverty when they gave out of their wealth. And to me, generosity sometimes isn't just how much we give. Maybe he's looking at it differently and saying, how much are you keeping? Like, because she gave all that she had, is actually the way the verse says it. So she gave all that she had. And again, it's that level of trust. Like, to me, she was trusting God in a very deep way.
Right.
And saying, I trust my Father that what little I have, I'm giving to him, and I know he's going to take care of me. And I want to give that as an offering to him. Or Mary with the spikenard that says, hey, I'm breaking this jar on Jesus. And, some people have kind of surmised that may have been her, marriage dowry or something like that. Like, that would have been a big deal that she was kind of putting on Jesus. And you go, wait, what's God trying to teach us here? Because it's not something's about the math. It's about really the heart. Like, generosity comes from a place of, sometimes it means doing things that aren't rational. Like, it might mean doing something that seems extravagant or out of the ordinary.
Or scary.
Yeah, and even scary. Yeah. Like, so how do we learn to do that? And I think as adults it's hard, but if we can teach our kids and kind of get them doing it as they're little, then it becomes easier as adults. And to me, if the church lived that way, like we corporately as a church lived more like that, wouldn't the world look at us differently? Wouldn't they go, like, it's what you see at the end of Acts 2 at the early church, when the believers were living very extravagantly and just sort of taking care of the poor around them and all that kind of stuff in a time when they were persecuted in Jerusalem. And yet they were an example to the world, and people, as a result, the church grew like crazy. People became Christians.
It was attractive.
Because it was, it was attractive. It was winsome. And so you have, wouldn't it be cool if we all lived that way? So and it's hard, because I know for me, like, I want to live that way. And yet at the same time, I'm also like, wait, I'm the planner. Like, we've got to save for retirement. And those are all good things. And the Bible commends saving, and all those are all good things to do, and stewarding well and all that kind of stuff. But yet this attitude of the heart is sort of something that we have to put in the mix, and teaching our kids that is really important. So
I love that. It's just some of the things that you say to frame things like giving is not the same as a spirit of generosity. I mean, it just really helps illuminate. And in my mind, I need like categories to put things into. And so for me personally, it's so helpful, because I'm like, yes, it makes sense now to me. And I think one thing that I'm taking away amongst many things is it's not prescriptive. Like, giving isn't like, oh, you do this 10% and you check off this checkbox, now you're generous. Like, it's a little harder, right? Because sometimes just a checklist makes it easier. Am I doing it right? Check, and good, I'm generous, but sometimes there's some gray. Like, do we do this? Do we not? Like, and it's a question again, as you said, it comes back to that relationship with God. This is how you deal with your resources, your money, how you steward. There isn't like a clear-cut formula all the time. And it's about that engagement and that relationship with God. And I go back to, I think you said in the first episode, it determines how you handle your resources, how you handle money, determines the health of your relationship with God. And all of this fits into that, because again, if it's not prescriptive and it's about relationship, it's about being in tune with, what does God want me to do with this resource right now in this moment? Maybe it is being scary extravagant, or maybe it's not, but it's about listening to what God is putting on your heart at that time. Like you said, if that is something God is putting on your kid's heart, if they're super generous, not to squash that. And, or if your kid is not generous, maybe that's a call for you to do more things together as a family to plant the seed of the beauty of giving and generosity. And so, oh man, any final thoughts as we wrap up this incredible series? I
feel like you just did a great wrap up right there. Like, God's blessed us to be a blessing, right? That's what it's about. It is about the attitude. It's not about the math. And it's something, and I guess maybe the punchline is this: it's not something that what God wants from us, it's what he wants for us. Right?
So good.
Like, even the giving, like, when I tithe, when I give, like, God doesn't need my money. Like, God owns everything. He could, I mean, Jesus pulled coins out of a fish's mouth. Like, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, he doesn't need my money. He wants my heart. And that's just how my heart grows, is by being stretched that way. And so that's why it's such an important part of our spiritual growth, is learning how to stretch that way. You know, for me, one of the greatest things that I look at as far as stretching me in the area of generosity was when Jen and I gave to something we're doing at the church, and I just felt like God was calling us to do something that was way bigger than what we'd done before. And like, it was hard. Like, I was like, am I really hearing that from God? Like, and I knew it wasn't me, because I wouldn't come up with that idea. You know what I mean? Like, but it really stretched us. And I look back at that and I'm like, do I regret doing that? Not even for a second. It was like, God did some cool. Now, could I use that money today? Sure. Right. I mean, yes, but that's not the point. God used that in my life to grow me and to grow my wife. And it's what he wants for us, is that deep relationship, abiding relationship with him, and to really teach us to be generous people.
That's beautiful. All right. Well, parents, you've heard it here. It's not what God wants from you. It's what he wants for you. Right. That is so beautiful. And these whole 3-episode series has been such a blessing to me. And I know for our parents who are listening, tuning in, or watching. So thank you so much. We've really enjoyed this time.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
And parents, again, if you want to share this episode, and if you think there's a friend who could benefit from hearing some of these nuggets, please share, like, and comment, and subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet done that. Visit all of our incredible resources on the website onpurposeparents.com. Also, I didn't mention this in the past episodes, but if you do want to get resources, and Chris sends these out often and they're great, but little reminders on resources that are available, you can text parents to 83000 and you can get put on that list.
Weekly text.
Subscription. Oh, weekly text.
Yeah.
Yes. So thank you again to our wonderful guest, and parents, we love you and we are for you.
Thanks for being with us.
And have a great day, night, weekend. Bye, everybody.